The drunk cowboy mocked the silent cook's son until he pointed and whispered, "That man killed my mama." The bottle had been Jake Harrison's friend longer than any man on the trail. It rode with him in his saddlebags, slept beside his bedroll, and whispered sweet lies when the loneliness got too heavy to carry. Tonight, like most nights, it had done its job too well. He stumbled into the cattle camp as the sun bled red across the Texas sky, his boots catching on rocks he should have seen coming. The other cowboys looked up from their evening meal, some shaking their heads, others grinning at the familiar sight. Jake Harrison drunk was like rain in the desert. You knew it would come eventually, and when it did, it made a mess of everything. "Well, look what the wind blew in," called out Pete Jameson, the trail boss. His voice carried that particular mix of anger and tired acceptance that came from dealing with the same problem too many times. "You better not be riding her tomorrow in that condition, Jake." Jake waved a hand that moved like it was swimming through thick air. "Don't you worry about me, Pete. I can ride better drunk than most men can ride sober." He stumbled toward the fire where the camp cook, an old man named Moses, was ladling beans into tin plates. Beside Moses stood a boy of maybe 10 years, thin as a fence post and twice as quiet. The boy never spoke. Not once in all the months Jake had been riding with this outfit. The child just stirred pots, fetched water, and watched the world with eyes that seemed older than the hills around them. Some of the men said the boy was simple. Others claimed he was touched by God. Jake had his own theory. The kid was just smart enough to know that most words weren't worth saying. But tonight, with whiskey making him feel bold and foolish, Jake decided to test that silence. "Hey there, little mute," Jake slurred, pointing a finger that wavered like grass in the wind. "Cat still got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too good to talk to regular folks like us?" Moses shot Jake a look that could have melted iron. "Leave the boy be, Harrison. I'm just being friendly," Jake protested, though his grin said otherwise. He lurched closer to the fire, nearly stepping on the boy's foot. "Come on, kid. Just one word. Say howdy, or please, or thank you kindly. Something to prove you got a voice in there." The boy, Samuel, Moses called him, didn't look up from the beans he was stirring. His small hands gripped the wooden spoon tight, knuckles white as cotton. The flames danced across his face, showing features that would have been handsome if they weren't so hollow, so careful. A few of the other cowboys started chuckling. Not mean laughter, exactly, but the kind that comes when men are tired and bored and looking for something to pass the time. Jake fed off that attention like a fire feeds off dry wood. "Maybe he's saving up all his words," Jake continued, swaying on his feet. "Gonna write a book someday. The Silent Adventures of Moses' Kitchen Helper. More laughter. Or maybe he's practicing to be a preacher. You know how they like their dramatic pauses." Samuel's stirring stopped for just a moment. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or anger held down so deep it barely showed. Then he went back to stirring, slow and steady, like he was mixing more than just beans. Jake was warming up now, the whiskey and the audience making him feel 10 feet tall. "I bet I know what happened. His mama dropped him on his head when he was little. Knocked all the words clean out of his skull. That's why Moses here keeps him around. Someone's got to look after the broken ones." The laughter died a little at that. Even drunk men knew when a joke went too far. But Jake didn't notice, or didn't care. He was lost in his own performance, dancing on the edge of cruelty without seeing how far the drop was. Or maybe, Jake went on, his voice getting louder, maybe he's just scared. Some people are born scared, you know. Too scared to speak up, too scared to fight back, too scared to... That's enough. Moses stood up, all 6 feet of him unfolding like an angry mountain. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of feeding hungry men and keeping them alive. "You've had your fun, Jake. Now sit down and eat your supper before I decide you don't deserve any." Jake held up both hands in mock surrender, but his grin never faded. All right. No harm it. Just trying to get to know our silent friend here." He plopped down on a log near the fire, close enough to Samuel that the boy had to step sideways to avoid him. The camp settled back into its evening rhythm. Men ate beans and hardtack and talked about cattle and weather and the long miles still ahead. Moses served plates with the efficiency of a man who had done this same job 1,000 times before. And Samuel moved like a shadow around the fire, cleaning pots and feeding wood to the flames, never making a sound. But Jake wasn't done. The whiskey had him by the throat now, making him loud and reckless and mean in ways he might regret come morning. Every time Samuel walked past, Jake would make some comment about his small size, his careful movements, the way he flinched when anyone spoke too loud. "Look at him creep around," Jake muttered to the man sitting next to him, "like a church mouse. But he jumps at his own shadow." Samuel kept working, but his movements got tighter, more careful. His face stayed blank, but his hand shook just a little when he reached for the coffee pot. The other men started to look uncomfortable, the way people do when they're watching something ugly happen and don't know how to stop it. That's when they heard the horse. It came out of the darkness beyond the fire's reach, hooves making soft sounds in the dirt. Everyone turned to look, hands instinctively moving closer to their guns. Strange riders in the night usually meant trouble, and trouble was something cattle drives tried to avoid. The horse stepped into the circle of light, and they could see its rider, a man in his 30s with a face that might have been handsome once, before something wore it down to bone and shadow. He sat his saddle like someone who had been riding for days without rest, maybe weeks. His clothes were dusty but well-made, his gun worn smooth from use. Everything about him said cowboy, but something else said running. "Evening," the stranger called out, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was steady, polite, but tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. "Name's Tom Bridger. I'm looking for work. Heard you might need an extra hand." Pete Jameson stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. Trail bosses got good at reading men fast, and he was studying this one like a book. "We're always short-handed," Pete said carefully, "but I like to know who I'm hiring." "Where you coming from, Mr. Bridger?" "Up north," Bridger said, which wasn't really an answer. "Been riding the circuit for a while now. Good with cattle, better with horses. Don't drink much, don't cause trouble." Jake was watching all this with the loose attention of a drunk man, more interested in his bottle than in hiring decisions. But something made him glance over at Samuel, maybe just to see if the boy was still moving around like a scared mouse. What he saw sobered him faster than a bucket of cold water. Samuel had gone completely still. The coffee pot hung forgotten in his hands, steam rising from its spout like smoke from a gun barrel. The boy's face had turned the color of winter snow. All the blood drained away until he looked like a ghost standing by the fire. His eyes were locked on the stranger, wide and unblinking, full of something that looked like pure terror. Jake blinked hard, trying to clear the whiskey fog from his head. "Kid," he said, quieter now, "you all right there?" Samuel didn't answer. Couldn't answer, maybe. His whole body was trembling now, not just his hands. The coffee pot slipped from his fingers and hit the ground with a clatter that seemed loud as thunder in the sudden quiet. Then, slow as sunrise, Samuel raised one small hand and pointed at Tom Bridger. His finger was steady as a rifle's sight, aimed right at the stranger's heart. And for the first time in the 3 years Jake hadn't known him, Samuel opened his mouth and spoke. "That man killed my mama." The words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. Simple words, plain words, but they hit the camp like a physical blow, making grown men step backward and reach for weapons they weren't even thinking about drawing. Tom Bridger went still in his saddle. His face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or guilt, or just the knowledge that the past had finally caught up with him. Jake stared at Samuel, at this boy who had never spoken a word in his presence, who had just shattered the night with 5 words that changed everything. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on faces that had gone hard and suspicious. And Jake Harrison realized that all his cruel jokes, all his whiskey-soaked mockery, had been aimed at a child carrying a burden heavier than any man on this trail had ever been asked to bear. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a stone. The morning came gray and cold, like God had forgotten to light the sun. Jake Harrison woke with his head pounding and his mouth tasting like he'd been chewing leather, but for once the whiskey wasn't to blame for how sick he felt. Samuel's words from a night before echoed in his skull. That man killed my mama. Tom Bridger had stayed. Pete Jameson made that decision after a long, quiet conversation that happened outside the fire's reach, voices too low for most folks to hear. They needed hands for the cattle, Pete said. The trail was long and dangerous, and good men were hard to find. Whatever had happened between Bridger and the boy's mother was in the past, and the past was a luxury they couldn't afford when 2,000 head of cattle needed moving. Moses had argued, his old voice cracking with something that might have been desperation or rage. Jake couldn't hear the words, but he could see the way Moses' hands moved, quick and angry, pointing first at Bridger and then at Samuel. But Pete held firm. Business was business. The cattle wouldn't drive themselves. Now Bridger was saddling his horse in the pre-dawn light, moving with the careful efficiency of a man who had learned to pack his whole life into saddlebags. He looked ordinary in daylight, just another cowboy with weathered hands and dust in his hair. But Jake found himself studying the man's face, looking for signs of the killer Samuel claimed he was. What he saw was something worse than evil. He saw emptiness. Tom Bridger moved through the world like a man walking through his own grave, going through the motions of living without any of the life behind it. His eyes were the color of winter sky, and just as cold. When he spoke to the other men, his voice was polite and distant, like he was talking to them from the other side of a long canyon. Samuel hadn't said another word since the night before. The boy sat by the dying fire, knees drawn up to his chest, watching Bridger with the fixed attention of a rabbit watching a snake. He'd refused breakfast, pushing away the plate Moses offered him without even looking down. His small hands twisted together in his lap, fingers moving in patterns that made no sense to anyone but him. "Boy needs to eat," Jake found himself saying to Moses as they watched Samuel from across the camp. The word surprised him. When had he started caring about the kids' eating habits? Moses looked at him with eyes that held 40 years of frontier hardship and something newer, something that looked like fear. "Samuel hasn't eaten since that man rode in," Moses said quietly. "Hasn't slept either, far as I can tell. Just sits there, watching." "Maybe Pete made the wrong call," Jake said, though he kept his voice low. Trail bosses didn't like having their decisions questioned, especially not by drunk cowboys. "Pete made the only call he could make," Moses replied, but there was bitterness in his words. "We're 3 men short already, and the cattle won't wait. But that don't make it right." He paused, looking over at Samuel. "That boy's been carrying this load for 3 years. Now, the weight of it's right here in camp with him, sleeping 20 feet from his bedroll." Jake wanted to ask questions about Samuel's mother, about what had really happened, about why a child was traveling with a cattle drive in the first place. But something in Moses' face warned him off. Some stories couldn't be rushed. They had to be given, not taken. The day passed slowly. The cattle moved like a river of brown and white hide, their hooves raising clouds of dust that settled on everything. Clothes, food, the inside of Jake's throat. He rode drag, eating dust and chasing strays, but his mind kept wandering back to camp, to a silent boy and the man who had stolen his voice. When they stopped for the noon meal, Jake watched Samuel pick at his food like it was made of sand. The boy kept glancing up at Tom Bridger, who sat apart from the other men, eating his beans with the same methodical emptiness he did everything else. Each time their eyes nearly met, Samuel would look down quick, his whole body tensing like he expected to be struck. Jake had seen fear before. He'd seen men scared of Indians, scared of rattlesnakes, scared of dying alone on the trail. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that lived in your bones, that colored every breath you took and every step you walked. Samuel wasn't just afraid of Tom Bridger. He was afraid of the memory that Bridger carried, afraid of the moment when his world had broken apart. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Jake found himself sitting close to Moses by the fire. The old cook was mending a torn sack, his needle moving in and out of the rough cloth with practiced ease. Samuel was nearby, scrubbing pots with movements that were more nervous energy than cleaning. "How long you been looking after him?" Jake asked quietly. Moses glanced up from his sewing. 3 years, near about. Since his mama died. She was your kin? No. Moses set down his needle and looked across the fire at Samuel. But she was good people. Worked at the hotel in Abilene, trying to make an honest living for her and the boy. Times were hard, but she was managing. Jake waited. Some stories needed silence to grow in. She played cards sometimes. Moses continued, his voice soft as smoke. Not for big money, just enough to buy Samuel new boots or put food on the table. She was good at it, too. Had a head for numbers, could read faces like they were books. His hand stilled on the sack. That's what got her killed. A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Samuel looked up from his pot scrubbing, and Jake could see the boy was listening, though he pretended not to be. Bridger was passing through town. Moses went on. Been drinking heavy, losing money he probably didn't have. Sarah, that was Samuel's mama. She kept winning hands. Nothing big, just enough to make a drunk man angry. Bridger accused her of cheating. Was she? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Moses shook his head. Sarah never cheated at cards. Didn't need to. But try telling that to a man who's had his pride soaked in whiskey. He picked up his needle again, but didn't resume sewing. Words got heated. Bridger called her names I won't repeat. Sarah told him to take his losses like a man and walk away. Jake could feel where this story was going, could see it coming like storm clouds on the horizon. But he couldn't stop listening. Bridger claimed she went for a gun, Moses said. Said it was self-defense. But Samuel was there, hiding under the table where his mama had put him when the trouble started. Boy saw everything. Sarah wasn't reaching for any gun. She was reaching for her daughter's medicine bottle, trying to protect the baby from the shouting. Daughter? Jake asked. Samuel had a little sister. Mary, her name was. Just 2 years old, sick with fever. Sarah kept the medicine in her coat pocket, always within reach. Moses's voice got quieter. Bridger saw her hand move and drew fast. Shot her down right there in front of her children. The silence that followed felt heavy as stone. Samuel had stopped scrubbing the pot entirely now, just holding it in his shaking hands. His eyes were fixed on the fire, but Jake could tell he was seeing something else, a hotel room, maybe, or a card table, or his mother falling to the floor. What happened to the little girl? Jake asked. Fever took her 2 days later, Moses said simply. Without her mama there to tend her, she just faded away. Samuel watched her die too. Jake felt something break apart inside his chest, something he'd been carrying around without knowing it. He looked at Samuel, really looked at him, and saw not just a quiet boy, but a child who had lost everything that mattered in the space of 3 days. No wonder he didn't speak. What words could possibly carry the weight of that much grief? So you took him in, Jake said. Somebody had to. Boy had nowhere else to go, no family left. Moses finally resumed his sewing, his stitches small and careful. Figure I could teach him cooking, give him a trade. Trail crews always need good cooks. It's not much of a life, but it's better than the alternatives. Across the camp, Tom Bridger was rolling out his bedroll, preparing for sleep. He moved with the same careful emptiness as always, but now Jake could see something else in his movements, a kind of practiced avoidance, like a man trying not to look at his own shadow. Does Bridger know? Jake asked. About Samuel, I mean. About who he is? Moses shrugged. Hard to say. Boy's grown some in 3 years, and Bridger was drunk that night. Might not recognize him. Or maybe he does know and just doesn't care. Some men are good at forgetting the things that hurt them. Samuel set down the pot and stood up slowly. His movements were careful, like he was made of glass, and one wrong step might shatter him into pieces. He looked across the camp at Tom Bridger, and for a moment his face showed something Jake had never seen there before. Not just fear, but a kind of burning sadness that seemed too big for such a small body to hold. Then Samuel turned and walked away from the fire, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camp's edge. Moses started to rise, but Jake caught his arm. Let me, Jake said, surprising himself again with words he hadn't planned to speak. He found Samuel sitting on a low rock about 50 yards from camp, far enough away to be alone, but close enough to run back if trouble came. The boy was crying silently, tears making clean tracks down his dust-covered cheeks. He didn't look up when Jake approached, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. Jake sat down on the ground beside the rock, not too close, giving Samuel space to be afraid if he needed to be. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the night, sounds of cattle settling down and coyotes calling to each other across the empty miles. "I'm sorry," Jake said finally, his voice rough with something that might have been shame. "For last night. For the things I said. I didn't know." Samuel wiped his nose on his sleeve, but didn't respond. Jake hadn't really expected him to. "Moses told me about your mama," Jake continued. "About your sister, too. That's a heavy load for anyone to carry, especially a boy your age." Still nothing from Samuel, but Jake could see the boy's shoulders shaking a little, like he was trying to hold something back. "I know you probably don't want to hear this from me," Jake said, "but you're stronger than most grown men I know. Surviving what you've survived, carrying what you're carrying, that takes a special kind of courage." Samuel turned to look at him then, his eyes bright with tears and something else, something that looked almost like hope. For a moment, Jake thought the boy might speak again, might trust him with more words. But Samuel just nodded once, a tiny movement that somehow felt like forgiveness. They sat together until the fire burned low and Moses called Samuel back for his evening chores. As they walked back toward camp, Jake found himself wondering what it would feel like to carry the weight of so much loss, so much silence, so much fear. Tomorrow, he knew, they would all wake up and ride the same trail, eat the same food, sleep under the same stars. But something had changed between him and Samuel, something small but important. For the first time, Jake found himself thinking not about his own pain, his own loneliness, his own need for the bottle's false comfort. Instead, he was thinking about justice and what a man might do when justice was too long in coming. The third night came with a wind that tasted of dust and regret. Jake Harrison lay on his bedroll, staring up at stars that seemed colder than usual, listening to the sound of 2,000 cattle breathing in the darkness. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Samuel's face, first laughing at cruel jokes he didn't understand, then white with terror, then wet with silent tears. Jake had never thought of himself as a hero. Heroes were the men in dime novels, the ones who rode white horses and always knew right from wrong. Jake Harrison rode a brown gelding with a mean streak, drank too much, and usually couldn't tell right from wrong until it was too late to matter. But something about Samuel's quiet pain had gotten under his skin like a splinter, working its way deeper every day. 3 bedrolls over, Tom Bridger was sleeping, or pretending to sleep. His breathing was too careful, too measured. Jake could see the man's silhouette against the star-filled sky, perfectly still except for the slight rise and fall of his chest. Even in sleep, Bridger looked like he was running from something. Jake sat up slowly, trying not to wake the men around him. The camp was quiet except for the night sounds, cattle shifting, horses nickering softly, the distant cry of a coyote. Pete Jameson was on first watch, riding slow circles around the herd. Moses was snoring by the dying fire. Samuel curled up beside him like a cat seeking warmth. Moving careful as a stalking wolf, Jake pulled on his boots and stood up. His gun belt hung from a post driven into the ground beside his bedroll. He looked at it for a long moment, then left it where it was. This wasn't about gunfighting. This was about something harder to name. He walked to the edge of camp, where Tom Bridger's horse was picketed with the others. Bridger's saddle sat on the ground nearby, his rifle resting against it. The man kept his gear neat and ready, like someone who might need to leave in a hurry. "I know you're awake," Jake said quietly to the darkness where Bridger lay. For a moment, nothing. Then Bridger sat up, moving with the fluid grace of a man who slept with one ear open. Even in the starlight, Jake could see the wariness in his posture. "Something you need, Harrison?" Bridger's voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had learned not to show weakness. "Yeah," Jake said. "I need to know why you killed that woman." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Bridger was quiet for so long that Jake began to think he wouldn't answer. Then, slow as sunrise, Bridger stood up and brushed the dust from his pants. "Which woman would that be?" Bridger asked, but his voice had changed. The careful control was still there, but something underneath, it was cracking. "You know which woman." "Samuel's mother." "Sarah." Jake stepped closer, close enough to see Bridger's face clearly. "The one you shot down in front of her children." Bridger closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they looked older than the hills around them. "So the boy remembers." "The boy remembers everything," Jake said. "Every detail. Every moment. You took his whole world away in the time it takes to pull a trigger." "You think I don't know that?" The words came out harsh, like they'd been scraped raw against Bridger's throat. "You think I don't carry that with me every day? If you carry it, why are you still walking free?" Bridger laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that had no joy in it, only pain. "Free? You call this free?" He gestured at the empty miles around them, the endless sky, the loneliness that stretched from horizon to horizon. "I haven't been free since that night. Haven't slept right, haven't eaten right, haven't drawn a peaceful breath. I'm carrying that woman's ghost on my back, and the weight of her is killing me by inches." "Good," Jake said, and he meant it. "But that don't change what you did." "No," Bridger agreed. "It doesn't." He walked to his saddle and sat down on it, like a man too tired to stand. "You want to hear what happened? The real story, not whatever version that boy's been carrying around." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Truth was often uglier than the stories people told about it. "I was drunk," Bridger began, his voice flat as beaten metal. "Had been drinking for 3 days straight, trying to wash away some business that went bad up in Kansas. Lost money I couldn't afford to lose, money that belonged to other people. Dangerous people." He paused, looking down at his hands. Even in the starlight, Jake could see they were shaking slightly. "I ended up in that hotel, playing cards with whoever would have me. The woman, Sarah, she was there with some other folks. Local game, nothing too serious. But she kept winning, hand after hand, and I kept losing. The whiskey was making me angry, making me stupid." Jake waited. Some confessions couldn't be rushed. "I accused her of cheating," Bridger continued. "Called her names I'm not proud of. She told me to take my losses like a man and walk away. Should have listened to her. Should have walked out of that room and never looked back. But you didn't." "No." I kept pushing, kept making noise. Got louder and meaner. The woman, she stood up from the table, said she was done with the game. Started to reach for something, her coat, I thought. But I was drunk and scared and scared angry men do stupid things." Bridger's voice cracked like old leather. "I drew on her, fast as I could. Shot her before she could even finish reaching for whatever she was reaching for. Watch her fall to the floor like a sack of grain. Watch the light go out of her eyes. The silence stretched between them. In the distance, Pete Jameson's horse made a soft sound as he continued his circuit around the herd. "You said self-defense," Jake said finally. "Elite." The words came out barely above a whisper. She wasn't reaching for a gun. She was reaching for a medicine bottle. For her sick baby. I saw it afterwards, saw the little bottle roll out of her coat when she hit the floor. Brown glass, no bigger than my thumb. Medicine for a child who was burning up with fever. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. Moses had told him the story, but hearing it from Bridger's own lips made it real in a way that hurt to think about. "The boy saw it all," Jake said. "Yeah, he was hiding under the table where she'd put him. Smart woman, trying to protect her children from the trouble she could see coming. But you can't protect children from everything, can you? Sometimes the trouble finds them anyway." Bridger stood up again, began pacing in small circles like a caged animal. "I ran that night. Took my horse and rode as far and fast as I could. Figured I could outrun what I'd done, find some corner of the world where it didn't matter. Been running ever since. Why'd you stop here? Why'd you ask Pete for work? Tired of running, I guess. Tired of looking over my shoulder. Figured maybe if I did some honest work, helped move some cattle, I might start to feel human again." Bridger stopped pacing and looked directly at Jake. But the moment I saw that boy's face in the firelight, I knew I'd never outrun it. Some things follow you no matter how far you ride. Jake was quiet for a long moment, digesting what he'd heard. The truth was worse than he'd expected, and also somehow not as bad. Bridger was a killer, but he was a broken killer, a man who had been eating himself alive with guilt for 3 years. "What are you going to do now?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Bridger said honestly. "What would you do?" Before Jake could answer, they heard a sound from the direction of camp. Footsteps in the dirt, soft and careful. They both turned to look. Samuel emerged from the darkness like a small ghost, walking toward them with something heavy in his hands. As he got closer, Jake could see what it was, an old Colt revolver, the kind that had seen better days, but still had plenty of killing left in it. "Samuel," Jake said, his voice gentle as he could make it. "What are you doing, son?" The boy didn't answer Jake. His eyes were fixed on Tom Bridger, and they burned with something that was part pain, part rage, and part something else, something that looked almost like relief. "Where'd you get that gun?" Bridger asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "It was my papa's," Samuel said, and his voice was clearer than Jake had ever heard it. "Mama kept it after he died. Said it might be useful someday." The gun wavered in his small hands, too heavy for him to hold steady. "I've been waiting 3 years to use it." Jake started to move, but Bridger held up a hand to stop him. "You don't want to do this, boy," Bridger said softly. "Killing me won't bring her back." "I know," Samuel replied, and there were tears running down his cheeks now. "But maybe it'll stop the dreams. Maybe it'll make the hurt stop." "No," Bridger said, shaking his head. "It won't. I killed your mother, and I've been dying a little every day since. Killing me will just pass that dying on to you. You're too young to carry that weight." Samuel's hands were shaking now, the gun moving in small circles. "You killed her for nothing," he said, his voice breaking. "She was reaching for my baby sister's medicine. Mary was sick, burning up with fever, and Mama was just trying to help her. You killed her for nothing." The words hit Bridger like physical blows. He staggered backward, his face crumpling with pain. "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know." Jake watched Samuel struggle with the weight of the gun, with the weight of 3 years of silence and grief and rage. The boy was right. Bridger had killed his mother for nothing, had destroyed a family over a card game and wounded pride. Justice said he deserved to die. But Jake was beginning to understand that justice and revenge weren't the same thing, and that sometimes the hardest choice was knowing which one you were really after. Samuel's small hands trembled as he held his father's gun, the weight of it too heavy for arms that should have been carrying fishing poles or school books instead of instruments of death. The barrel wavered in the starlight, sometimes pointing at Tom Bridger's chest, sometimes at the ground, as if the weapon itself couldn't decide between justice and mercy. Jake Harrison stood frozen between them, seeing his own reflection in this moment of reckoning. How many times had he been the one holding anger like a loaded gun, ready to fire at anyone who crossed him? How many times had whiskey convinced him that violence was the answer to pain? Tom Bridger had stopped trying to defend himself. He knelt in the dirt now, his head bowed like a man in church, accepting whatever judgment was coming. The fight had gone out of him completely, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man who had been carrying 3 years of guilt like stones in his pockets. "I deserve it," Bridger said quietly, his voice barely audible over the night wind. "I've been dead inside since that night anyway. Maybe it's time to make it official." Samuel's grip tightened on the gun. His young face was streaked with tears, but his eyes held a determination that was frightening to see in someone so small. "You took everything from me," he whispered. "Mama, Mary, my whole family. You left me with nothing but bad dreams and Moses' kindness." "I know," Bridger replied, "and I'm sorry. I know sorry doesn't bring them back, doesn't undo what I did. But I'm sorry, boy. More sorry than you'll ever know." Jake could see the moment stretching out like taffy, heavy with possibility. Samuel was balanced on a knife's edge between childhood and something darker, between healing and becoming the very thing that had destroyed his world. One squeeze of that trigger, and the boy would cross a line he could never uncross. "Samuel," Jake said softly, taking a small step forward. The gun swung toward him for a moment, and Jake saw his own death reflected in its dark barrel. But then Samuel recognized him, and the weapon drifted back toward Bridger. "Don't try to stop me, mister." "Harrison," Samuel said, using Jake's name for the first time since they'd known each other. "This is something I have to do." "What?" Jake asked, keeping his voice gentle as a summer breeze. "What will killing him give you that you don't already have?" Samuel blinked, confusion flickering across his features. "Justice. He killed my mama, and he should pay for it. And you think justice looks like a 10-year-old boy with a gun? You think your mama would want you to become a killer to honor her memory?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. His small shoulders shook, and for a moment Jake thought the boy might break down entirely. But Samuel held on, gripping the gun with white knuckles. "She's gone because of him," Samuel said, his voice cracking like ice on a warm day. "Mary's gone because of him. I wake up every night seeing it happen again, hearing the gunshot, watching her fall. Maybe if I kill him, the dreams will stop." Jake took another careful step forward. He was close enough now to reach for the gun if he had to, but he knew that wasn't the answer. This had to be Samuel's choice, made with his own heart and his own conscience. "Let me tell you something about killing, son," Jake said. "I've seen a lot of it in my time. War, range wars, saloon fights over nothing important. And I've never once seen killing make the dreams stop. If anything, it gives you new nightmares to carry alongside the old ones." Samuel's hands were shaking harder now. The gun barrel described small circles in the air, like a compass needle searching for true north. "But he deserves to die," Samuel protested, though his voice held less conviction than before. "Maybe he does," Jake agreed. "But do you deserve to be the one to kill him? Do you deserve to carry that weight for the rest of your life?" Tom Bridger raised his head then, looking directly at Samuel for the first time since the boy had appeared with the gun. His face was wet with tears, carved deep with lines of grief and regret. "The boy's right," Bridger said. "I do deserve to die, but not like this. Not by the hands of a child I've already hurt too much." He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "You want justice, Samuel? Real justice? Then let me face it like a man." Jake saw something shift in Bridger's posture, a straightening of the spine that spoke of a decision made. The hollow look in his eyes was being replaced by something else. Not quite hope, but perhaps the absence of despair. "There's a town 3 days' ride from here," Bridger continued. "Willow Creek. They've got a sheriff, a judge, a jail. I'll turn myself in, tell them everything. What I did to your mother, what I did to your sister by extension. I'll face whatever punishment they decide." Samuel stared at him, the gun still raised but no longer quite so steady. "You do that? Really? I should have done it 3 years ago," Bridger replied. "Should never have run in the first place. A man does something that terrible, he ought to face the consequences, not spend his life running from them." Jake watched the exchange, seeing the moment when Samuel began to understand that there might be another path besides the one that led through gunfire and blood. The boy's breathing was slowing, his grip on the weapon loosening slightly. "But what if they don't punish him enough?" Samuel asked, looking at Jake with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. "What if they just let him go?" "Then that's their choice to make," Jake said. "But at least you won't have to live with taking a man's life. At least you can sleep at night, knowing you chose mercy over revenge." Samuel was quiet for a long time, the gun growing heavier in his small hands. Around them, the night settled deeper, cattle lowing softly in the distance, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Jake could hear Moses stirring by the fire, probably wondering where Samuel had gone. "My mama always said violence just makes more violence," Samuel said finally, his voice so quiet Jake had a strain to hear it. "So the only way to stop the hurting was to choose not to hurt back." "Sounds like a wise woman," Jake replied. "She was." Samuel looked down at the gun in his hands, as if seeing it for the first time. "This was my papa's. He died when I was little, before Mary was born. Mama said he was a good man who never used this gun to hurt anybody who didn't have it coming. What do you think he would want you to do with it now?" Samuel considered this for a long moment. Then, slow as sunrise, he began to lower the weapon. His arms shook with the effort, Not from the weight of the gun, but from the weight of the choice he was making. "I think," Samuel said, his voice growing stronger, "I think he'd want me to be better than the man who killed my mama." Tom Bridger closed his eyes and let out a breath that seemed to carry 3 years of held tension. When he opened them again, they were clearer than Jake had ever seen them. "Thank you," Bridger whispered to Samuel. "Thank you for being stronger than I was." Samuel handed the gun to Jake, who took it carefully and set it on the ground beside Tom Bridger's saddle. The boy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving clean streaks through the dust on his cheeks. "Will you really turn yourself in?" Samuel asked Bridger. "I will. I give you my word, and I know that probably doesn't mean much coming from me, but it's all I have left to give." Jake found himself believing the man. There was something different about Bridger now, something that hadn't been there before. The decision to stop running, to face what he'd done, seemed to have given him back pieces of himself he'd lost along the way. They walked back to camp together, an unlikely trio bound by tragedy and the choice to step away from its continuation. Moses was awake, sitting by the fire and whittling, but he didn't ask questions when they emerged from the darkness. Some conversations were too private for sharing. Samuel went to his bedroll and curled up beside Moses, who put a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. Tom Bridger returned to his own sleeping place, but Jake noticed he didn't lie down right away. Instead, he sat looking up at the stars, probably seeing them clearly for the first time in years. Jake retrieved his bottle from his saddlebags and held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the whiskey sloshing inside. Then he upended it, letting the contents pour out into the dry earth. The liquid disappeared quickly, absorbed by soil that had been thirsty for much more than rain. 3 days later, they reached Willow Creek. It was a small town, dusty and tired-looking, but had what Tom Bridger needed: a sheriff's office with bars on the windows and a judge who wasn't afraid to hear hard truths. Jake watched from across the street as Bridger dismounted and walked into the sheriff's office. Through the window, he could see the man talking to the lawman, see the moment when understanding dawned on the sheriff's face. It would be a long conversation, full of difficult admissions and painful details. Samuel stood beside Jake, holding Moses' hand, but watching the sheriff's office with steady eyes. The boy had spoken more in the past 3 days than in all the months Jake had known him before. Not a lot, but enough to show that his voice was coming back, along with something that might eventually grow into peace. "Do you think he'll keep his word?" Samuel asked. "I think he will," Jake replied. "A man who chooses to stop running usually doesn't start again." They stayed in Willow Creek long enough to see Tom Bridger led to a jail cell, long enough to hear that there would be a trial in 6 weeks. The judge promised justice, whatever form that might take. It would have to be enough. As the cattle drive prepared to leave town, Samuel came to Jake one last time. The boy had grown somehow in the space between holding a gun and choosing not to use it. He carried himself straighter, spoke more clearly, looked people in the eye when he talked to them. "Thank you," Samuel said simply. "For what?" Jake asked. "For helping me choose the right thing. For not letting me become like him." Jake knelt down, so he was eye level with the boy. "You didn't need my help, son. That choice was all yours. Your mama would be proud of the man you're becoming." Samuel smiled then, the first real smile Jake had ever seen from him. It transformed his whole face, showing glimpses of the happy child he might have been if the world had been kinder. The cattle drive moved on, leaving Willow Creek and its promises of justice behind. But something had changed in the rhythm of their days. Jake no longer reached for his bottle when the loneliness got too heavy. Samuel no longer moved through the world like a frightened shadow. And Moses hummed old songs while he cooked, content in the knowledge that the boy he'd taken and was finally beginning to heal. Some wounds, Jake realized, could only be healed by choosing not to pass them on to the next person, the next generation, the next broken heart looking for someone to blame. It was a hard lesson, learned under desert stars with a child's trembling hands wrapped around his father's gun. But it was a lesson worth learning, and Jake Harrison, former drunk, former cruel jokester, former man who thought kindness was weakness, had finally found something worth staying sober for.